The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as Thomas walked along the shoreline. His feet left deep prints in the wet sand as he made his way to his small wooden boat, the same boat his father had used and his father before him. At 42, Thomas had spent more days on the water than he could count. Life hadn't been kind to Thomas lately. The once abundant waters near his small coastal village in the Philippines now yielded fewer fish each day. Climate change and big commercial fishing boats had taken their toll on these waters that had fed his family for generations. Thomas rubbed his rough, calloused hands together and looked out at the sea. The familiar smell of salt water filled his lungs as he took a deep breath. "Today will be better," he whispered to himself. The same words he had spoken every morning for the past 3 months. He pushed his boat into the gentle morning waves and climbed aboard with the agility of someone who had done this thousands of times. His fishing nets were neatly folded, ready for another day of work. The small motor sputtered to life, and Thomas steered his boat away from shore. Back home, his wife Anna was probably just waking up. He pictured her moving quietly around their small kitchen, trying not to wake their daughter Sophia. The thought of his 12-year-old daughter made his heart ache. Sophia had been sick for almost a year now. The doctors called it a rare blood condition, but all Thomas understood was that the treatment cost more money than a simple fisherman could ever hope to earn. As his boat cut through the calm morning waters, Thomas thought about yesterday's catch, barely enough to sell at the market, let alone pay for another round of Sophia's medicine. Anna had tried to hide her worry, but he had seen the fear in her eyes as she counted their savings hidden in an old coffee tin. They were running out of time and money. The boat drifted to Thomas's favorite fishing spot, a place where underwater currents brought small fish to feed. He cut the engine and let the gentle rocking of the waves calm his troubled mind. The water was clear enough that he could see several feet down, but not deep enough to reveal what truly lay beneath. "Just one good day," Thomas said to the sea. "That's all I'm asking for." He cast his first net with expert precision, the weights pulling it down into the water. Fishing was a waiting game, something that had taught Thomas patience over the years. But lately that patience was wearing thin. While he waited, Thomas looked at the photo he kept tucked inside his weatherproof jacket, a picture of Sophia on her 10th birthday, before the illness had taken hold. In it, she was laughing, her dark eyes shining with joy as she blew out candles on a small cake Anna had baked. Sophia had her mother's eyes and his stubborn chin. She was smart too, always bringing home perfect marks from school. The village teacher had once told Thomas that Sophia could go to college in the city someday, maybe become a doctor or engineer. "What good are dreams if she's not well enough to chase them?" Thomas mumbled, carefully tucking the photo away. After 30 minutes, Thomas pulled in his first net. Just 3 small fish, not even enough for his family's dinner, let alone to sell. He sighed and moved his boat to a different spot. The morning passed this way: cast, wait, disappointment, move. By noon, the hot sun beat down on his already sunburned neck, and his catch was pitiful. Other fishermen from his village dotted the horizon. Some had bigger boats with better equipment. A few had formed cooperatives, pooling their resources to compete with the commercial fishing operations. Thomas had been invited to join, but the entry fee was beyond his means. Everything extra went to Sophia's treatment. "Hey, Thomas," a voice called across the water. Manuel, a fisherman about 10 years younger than Thomas, steered his boat closer. "Any luck today?" Thomas shook his head. "The sea is keeping her treasures to herself." Manuel frowned sympathetically. "Same here. But listen, my cousin works for that new resort up the coast. They're looking for someone to take tourists out for day fishing trips. The pay is steady. I mentioned your name." Thomas's pride wanted to refuse immediately. He was a real fisherman, not some tour guide for rich tourists who thought catching a fish was a fun way to spend an afternoon. But Sophia's face flashed in his mind, and pride suddenly seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. "Thanks," he said finally. "Maybe I'll look into it." After Manuel left, Tomas tried one more spot before heading to the small fish market in the village. The market was less crowded than it used to be. Many fishermen had already sold their catch to restaurants or larger buyers. Some stalls stood empty. Their owners had given up fishing altogether and moved to the city for work. Mrs. Reyes, who had bought Thomas's fish for 20 years, looked at his meager catch with sad eyes. "Not much today, eh, Thomas?" The sea was not generous, he replied, a phrase his father had often used on bad days. She paid him less than half of what he would have earned 5 years ago for the same amount. It wasn't her fault. There were fewer customers willing to pay good prices these days. Thomas pocketed the money and calculated quickly in his head. Not enough for Sophia's medicine, not even close. On his walk home, Thomas passed the small medical clinic where Dr. Garcia had first noticed Sophia's symptoms. The doctor had immediately referred them to a specialist in the city, 3 hours away by bus. Each visit drained their savings a little more. "Tomas!" "Wait up," Dr. Garcia called, stepping out of the clinic. The young doctor had grown up in the village before leaving for medical school. He had returned to help his community, turning down higher-paying jobs in Manila. "How is Sophia doing?" the doctor asked, concern etched on his face. "No better, no worse," Thomas answered. "We're going back to the city next week for more tests." Dr. Garcia nodded. "I've been making some calls. There's a medical program that might be able to help with the costs. No promises, but bring Anna by tomorrow and we'll fill out the application." A tiny spark of hope flickered in Thomas's chest. "Thank you, doctor." When Thomas finally reached his small house on the edge of the village, he paused outside to compose himself. He didn't want Anna to see his discouragement. The house needed repairs. The roof leaked during heavy rains, and the wooden steps were rotting. But those problems would have to wait. He heard Sophia's laugh from inside, a sound that had become rare and precious. Taking a deep breath, Thomas pushed open the door. "Papa," Sophia called from where she sat at the table drawing pictures. She looked tired, her face thinner than it should be, but her smile was as bright as ever. Anna turned from the stove where she was cooking rice. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know about his day. But in front of Sophia, they maintained their hopeful facade. "Look what I drew," Sophia said, holding up a colorful picture of a boat on blue water. "It's you bringing home a boat full of treasure." Tomas felt his throat tighten. "It's beautiful," he managed to say. "You're quite the artist." Anna served a simple dinner of rice and the few fish Thomas had caught, stretching the meal with vegetables from their small garden. After they ate, Sophia quickly grew tired, another symptom of her illness, and Anna took her to bed. When his wife returned, Tomas was sitting outside on their small porch, staring at the distant ocean, now silver in the moonlight. Dr. Garcia mentioned a program that might help with the medical bills, he told her as she sat beside him. Anna took his rough hand in hers. "That would be a blessing." After a pause, she added, "Manuel's wife stopped by today. She mentioned something about tourist fishing trips." Thomas nodded. "Manuel told me. The idea of taking rich people out to play at fishing." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Your father would understand," Anna said softly. "He would say a man does what he must for his family." They sat in silence, listening to the distant sound of waves hitting the shore. The same waves that had provided for Thomas's family for generations were now failing him when he needed them most. "I'll go out earlier tomorrow," Thomas finally said. "Try some spots farther out." Anna squeezed his hand. "You always say your grandfather told you that the sea rewards those who respect her, but sometimes tests their faith first." Thomas looked up at the stars. His grandfather had been full of such sayings, most of which Thomas had dismissed as old man's talk. Now he found himself clinging to them, hoping for some truth in the ancient wisdom. "One good day," he whispered. "That's all we need." As he lay in bed that night, listening to Sophia's slightly labored breathing from the next room, Thomas made a decision. Tomorrow, he would go farther out than he had ever gone before. There were deeper waters beyond the bay, waters that the older fishermen spoke of with both reverence and fear, waters where the big fish might still be plentiful. It was risky. His small boat wasn't built for those waters, and storms could appear quickly. But risk seemed like a small price to pay for Sophia's smile. As sleep finally claimed him, Tomas dreamed of nets full of fish and his daughter, healthy and strong, running along the beach without tiring. Tomorrow would be different. It had to be. The next morning arrived with the first hints of trouble. Dark clouds hung low on the horizon, and the air felt heavy with moisture. Most fishermen would take one look at that sky and decide to stay home, but Thomas didn't have that luxury. He left earlier than usual, slipping out of bed while Anna and Sophia were still sleeping. He packed extra water and food, knowing he'd be gone longer today. Before leaving, he stood in the doorway of Sophia's small room, watching her chest rise and fall. In sleep, she looked almost like her old self. Before the illness had taken hold, "I'll find a way," he whispered, a promise to both his daughter and himself. The village was quiet as Thomas made his way to the shore. Only a few lights glowed in windows, other early risers preparing for their day. At the beach, Thomas was surprised to find he wasn't alone. Old Pedro, who rarely fished anymore due to his arthritis, was sitting on an overturned crate smoking his pipe. "You're heading out today?" the old man asked, eyebrows raised as he looked toward the threatening sky. Thomas nodded, pushing his boat toward the water. "Need to try the deeper waters," Pedro shook his head. "Weather report says a storm is coming. Not a big one, but enough to make those waters dangerous for a small boat like yours." "I'll be back before it hits," Thomas said, not meeting the older man's eyes. They both knew it was a lie. Pedro stood up with some effort and walked to Tomas's boat. From his pocket, he pulled out a small object, a carved wooden fish, polished smooth by years of handling. "My father gave this to me when I was a boy," Pedro said, pressing it into Tomas's palm. "Said it would help me find fish and keep me safe. I've carried it every day for 60 years. He closed Tomas's fingers around it. "Today you need it more than me." Tomas tried to refuse, but Pedro had already turned away, waving off his protests. "Just bring it back tomorrow," he called over his shoulder. "And yourself with it." With the wooden charm tucked safely in his pocket, Thomas pushed off. The weight of Pedro's concern and generosity stayed with him as his boat cut through the increasingly choppy water. The old man had seen something in his eyes, the desperation, the willingness to take risks. Thomas wondered if he'd made the same look once in his younger days. The journey took longer than expected. The waves worked against him, pushing his small boat back toward shore as if warning him to return. By the time the sun had fully risen, though hidden behind thick clouds, Thomas had traveled farther from the coast than ever before. The familiar shoreline was just a thin line in the distance. Out here, the water was a deeper blue, almost black in places. Thomas knew these waters were home to bigger fish, tuna, mackerel, and others that rarely came close to shore anymore. The commercial fishing boats had driven them away from their traditional grounds, forcing them into these deeper channels. The boat rocked violently as larger waves passed beneath it. Thomas gripped the sides, his knuckles white. The sky had darkened further and a steady wind was picking up. He needed to work quickly. His first cast in the deep water yielded nothing, nor did the second. By the third attempt, doubt was creeping in. Had he risked everything for nothing? The storm clouds were moving faster now, and the distant rumble of thunder reached his ears. "Just one more try," Thomas muttered, moving his boat to a spot where the water swirled in strange patterns. He'd never seen currents like these, circular motions that seemed to pull downward, as if something beneath was drawing the water in. Casting his net here was difficult. The currents fought him, twisting the net in unnatural ways. But Thomas was nothing if not stubborn. With extra effort, he managed to get the net properly deployed, watching as it sank deeper than before. While he waited, the wind picked up considerably. Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. The distant shoreline disappeared behind a curtain of gray. Thomas knew he should head back immediately, but the net was still down. He couldn't abandon it, not just because he couldn't afford to lose it, but because something told him to wait. Call it a fisherman's instinct or plain desperation, but he felt certain this cast would be different. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very air. The storm was no longer approaching, it had arrived. Waves that had been manageable were now growing into small mountains of water that lifted his boat up and dropped it down with stomach-churning force. Just a few more minutes, Thomas told himself, gripping the side of his boat as another wave lifted it high. When the boat crashed back down, water splashed over the sides. He would need to bail soon if this continued. Finally, Thomas decided he couldn't wait any longer. The storm was intensifying, and his small boat wouldn't survive much more of this punishment. He began the difficult process of hauling in his net, fighting against both the weight of the water and the pull of the strange currents. Something was wrong. The net was heavier than it should be, even if it was full of fish. Thomas pulled harder, muscles straining, hands burning as the rough rope slid through his fingers. For a moment, he feared the net had become tangled on something below. a rock formation or piece of debris that would force him to cut it loose. But the net was moving, slowly rising toward the surface. Thomas pulled with renewed energy, ignoring the rain that pounded his face and the waves that threatened to tip his small craft. Whatever was in that net, he was determined to bring it up. A flash of lightning illuminated the water just as the first part of the net broke the surface. Thomas caught a glimpse of something reflecting the light, something that wasn't the silver flash of fish scales. His heart pounded as he continued to pull, now driven by curiosity as much as necessity. With one final mighty effort, Thomas hauled the net over the side of his boat. He collapsed back, breathing heavily, giving himself just a moment to recover before examining his catch. The boat rocked violently beneath him, water sloshing around his feet. He would need to bail soon and head for shore before the storm grew worse. Lightning flashed again, brighter this time, and Thomas turned to look at what he'd caught. A few fish thrashed in the net, not many, but some decent-sized ones that would fetch a good price. But they weren't what caught his eye. Tangled among the fish and seaweed was something that didn't belong. Something man-made. Through the heavy rain, Thomas could make out what looked like a bag, dark and covered in algae but clearly not natural. It had been sealed tightly and seemed undamaged despite its time underwater. For a moment, Thomas forgot about the storm raging around him. He reached for the bag, his hands shaking from both exhaustion and anticipation. What could it be? Trash, most likely. The oceans were full of human garbage these days. But something about the way it was sealed, the weight of it in his hands, told him this was different. Before he could investigate further, a massive wave crashed into the side of the boat, nearly capsizing it. Thomas was thrown against the opposite side, the mysterious bag flying from his grasp. Cold seawater filled the boat at an alarming rate. "No," Thomas shouted, lunging across the boat to grab the bag before it could be washed overboard again. His fingers closed around it just in time. Holding it tightly to his chest with one hand, he used the other to grab the small bucket he kept for bailing. The next 20 minutes were a desperate fight for survival. Thomas bailed water frantically, started the motor, and pointed his boat toward shore. The storm howled around him, rain coming down so hard it was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Waves crashed over the sides faster than he could bail, and the small motor struggled against the powerful currents. Several times Thomas was sure he wouldn't make it. The shoreline was invisible through the storm, and he was navigating purely on instinct and memory. His arms ached from bailing and his clothes were soaked through, leaving him chilled to the bone. But he kept going, one hand still clutching the mysterious bag he'd found. After what seemed like hours, the rain began to lighten. The worst of the storm was passing, moving inland. Thomas could make out the faint outline of the shore ahead. He was off course. The storm had pushed him several miles south of the village. But he was alive, and his boat, though battered, was still floating. As he approached the unfamiliar stretch of beach, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. The adrenaline that had kept him going was fading, leaving him shaky and weak. But curiosity about his find gave him a second wind. Thomas guided his boat into a small cove protected from the remaining wind. Once the keel scraped against sand, he cut the motor and half fell over the side, pulling the boat further up onto the beach with his last reserves of strength. Finally safe, Thomas collapsed onto the wet sand, his chest heaving. For several minutes he simply lay there, feeling the rain, now just a light drizzle on his face. He was alive. He had survived. And he still had the strange bag. Sitting up slowly, Thomas placed the bag in front of him. Now that he could see it clearly, he noticed it wasn't just any bag. It was a waterproof container, the kind divers and boaters use to protect valuable equipment. Though covered in algae and barnacles, the seal appeared intact. Whatever was inside would be dry and preserved. With trembling fingers, Thomas began to clear away the sea growth. Questions raced through his mind. Who had lost this? How long had it been in the water? And most importantly, what was inside? He looked up at the sky, now clearing to reveal patches of blue. The storm had passed. But for Thomas, another kind of storm was just beginning, one that would change his life forever. The waterproof container sat before Thomas on the wet sand, covered in seaweed and barnacles. His heart pounded as he worked at the clasps. They were corroded from their time underwater, but the seal had held. Whatever was inside would be dry and protected. After a struggle, The first clasp popped open with a metallic click. Then the second. Thomas paused, suddenly unsure. Part of him wanted to push the container back into the sea, to return to his normal life without the complication of whatever this might be. But Sophia's face flashed in his mind, pale and thin from her illness, and he knew he couldn't walk away. Taking a deep breath, Thomas lifted the lid. At first, he wasn't sure what he was looking at. The container was lined with what looked like dark cloth. Carefully, he reached in and pulled back the fabric, revealing something that glinted in the sunlight breaking through the clouds. Thomas gasped. Inside the container were gold coins, dozens of them, stacked in neat rows. Beside them lay a small figure carved from pale green stone. And at the bottom, wrapped in more cloth, was a bundle of papers sealed in a clear plastic sleeve. His hands shaking, Thomas picked up one of the coins. It was heavier than he expected, the metal cool against his skin. One side showed the profile of a man wearing a crown, the other some kind of coat of arms. The writing around the edge wasn't in English or any language Thomas recognized. It can't be, he whispered to himself. Stories of sunken Spanish galleons had circulated among fishermen in this region for generations. Tales of ships laden with gold that went down in storms hundreds of years ago. Most considered them just that, stories. But here, in his weathered hands, Thomas held what could only be described as treasure. He placed the coin back carefully and picked up the small green figure. It was about the size of his palm, carved to depict some kind of animal, perhaps a jaguar, with intricate details despite its small size. The stone seemed to catch the light in unusual ways, almost glowing from within. The papers, when he carefully pulled them from their protective sleeve, were fragile and yellow with age. The writing was faded, but Thomas could make out what looked like a map and some kind of list or inventory. There were dates at the top from the 1500s. Thomas sat back on his heels, stunned. If these were genuine artifacts from a Spanish shipwreck, they would be worth a fortune. More than enough to pay for Sophia's treatment. More than enough to buy a new boat, a better house, to ensure his family never worried about money again. But as the initial shock wore off, new thoughts crept in. Items like these would be protected by law. They were historical artifacts that belonged in museums. Taking them, selling them, that would be illegal. He could end up in prison, separated from the very family he was trying to help. The sun was higher now, the storm nothing but a memory as blue skies stretched overhead. Thomas knew he needed to get home. Anna would be worried sick. But he couldn't just leave the container on the beach, nor could he walk into the village with it for everyone to see. After some thought, Thomas resealed the container. He dug a shallow hole in the sand beneath some rocks at the back of the beach, well above the tide line, and buried it. He marked the spot carefully in his mind, using a distinctive twisted tree and a large boulder as reference points. Then, taking only one coin and the green figurine as proof of his find, he pushed his boat back into the water. The journey back to the village took over an hour. His boat, battered by the storm, moved more slowly than usual, and Thomas was exhausted. But his mind raced the entire way, turning over possibilities, weighing options. By the time he reached the familiar shore, he still had no clear plan. People rushed to help as he pulled in. Word of the storm and his absence had spread worry throughout the small community. Old Pedro was there, relief visible on his weathered face. "You made it back," the old man said, helping to secure the boat. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't." Thomas managed a tired smile, returning the wooden fish charm. "It kept me safe, just like you said." Anna arrived moments later, running down the beach with fear in her eyes. She threw her arms around him, holding tight. "Don't ever do that again," she whispered fiercely. "Sophia and I need you alive more than we need money." Guilt twisted in Tomas's stomach. He had risked everything today, and now he carried an even bigger secret. The coin and figurine were hidden in an inside pocket of his jacket, pressing against his chest like a weight. "How is Sophia?" he asked as they walked home together. "The same. Dr. Garcia stopped by with forms for that medical program he mentioned. We filled them out, but he says it could be weeks before we hear anything. Weeks that Sophia might not have." The thought strengthened Thomas's resolve. He needed to find out what his discovery was worth, and quickly. At home, Sophia was overjoyed to see him, though too weak to get out of bed. He sat with her, telling edited versions of his adventure, the big waves, the struggle to get home, carefully omitting any mention of what he'd found. Did you catch lots of fish, Papa? She asked, her eyes bright despite her pallor. Thomas nodded. Some, but more importantly, I think our luck is about to change. Later that night, after Sophia was asleep, Thomas showed Anna what he had brought home. They sat at their small kitchen table, the coin and figurine between them, gleaming in the light of their single lamp. Where did you find these? Anna whispered, not daring to touch them. Thomas told her everything, the strange currents, the container, the full extent of what he had discovered and where he had hidden it. This could be the answer to our prayers, he said, watching her face carefully. We could pay for Sophia's treatment, the best doctors, the best medicine. Anna's expression was troubled. But if these are historical artifacts, they belong to whoever found them, Thomas said more firmly than he felt.
The sea gave them to me. The authorities won't see it that way, Anna countered.
You know the laws about historical finds. She was right, and Thomas knew it. Legally, he should report his discovery to the proper authorities. There might be a finder's fee, but most of the value would be lost to them. The treatment Sophia needed couldn't wait for government bureaucracy. What about Ricardo? Anna suggested after a long silence. His cousin works at that museum in the city. Maybe he could tell us what these are worth without reporting them officially. Ricardo was a childhood friend who had moved to the city years ago, but still visited the village occasionally. He wasn't entirely trustworthy, known for cutting corners and bending rules, but he might be their best option. He's coming for his mother's birthday next weekend, Anna added. We could show him then. Thomas nodded slowly. It was a risk, but a calculated one. Until then, we tell no one. The next few days passed in a strange haze for Thomas. He went through the motions of his daily life, fishing, selling his catch, caring for Sophia, but his mind was constantly on the buried container and what it might mean for his family's future. He returned to the sea, but not to his usual fishing grounds. Instead, he found himself drawn back to the area of strange currents where he'd made his discovery. Something about that place called to him. Twice more he cast his nets there, finding nothing unusual but still feeling that there was more to be found. Word of his adventure in the storm had spread through the village. Some thought him brave, others foolish. Old Pedro watched him with knowing eyes but asked no questions. At night, Thomas would take out the coin and figurine when he was alone, examining them by lamplight. The more he looked at the small jade carving, the more unusual it seemed. The way it caught the light wasn't natural. Sometimes he could swear it glowed faintly even in complete darkness, though Anna insisted it was his imagination. 4 days after his discovery, Sophia took a turn for the worse. Her fever spiked in the middle of the night, and by morning, she was struggling to breathe. Dr. Garcia came immediately, his face grim as he examined her. She needs to go to the hospital in the city, he said quietly to Thomas and Anna. Today. The infection has spread to her lungs. We don't have enough money, Anna said, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Garcia placed a hand on her shoulder. The application for the medical program was approved yesterday. I was coming to tell you today. It will cover part of the cost, but you'll still need to pay something. Thomas's hand went to his pocket where the coin rested. How much? The doctor named a sum that would have been impossible a week ago. Now it was within reach if he could find a buyer for just one of those coins. We'll have it, Thomas said firmly. Can you arrange transport to the city? As Dr. Garcia left to make the arrangements, Thomas pulled Anna aside. I'm going to the city with Sophia. While she's in the hospital, I'll find someone to look at the coin. Someone who will pay cash and not ask questions. Anna looked troubled but nodded. Their daughter's life hung in the balance. Questions of legality seemed less important now. Be careful, she whispered, and come back to me. Thomas kissed her forehead. Always. As he packed a small bag for the journey, Thomas looked out the window toward the sea. The water was calm today, sunlight dancing on the gentle waves. Somewhere beneath that peaceful surface lay answers to questions he hadn't even thought to ask yet. About the origin of the treasure, its journey to the bottom of the sea, and why, after hundreds of years, it had found its way into his net. For now, those questions would have to wait. Sophia needed him. But Thomas knew with absolute certainty that his life had changed forever. The sea had finally rewarded his faith, but at what cost? The journey to the city was the longest 3 hours of Thomas's life. He sat in the back of Dr. Garcia's old car, Sophia's head resting on his lap. Her breathing was shallow, her skin hot to the touch. Every bump in the road made him wince, afraid of causing her more pain. How much further? Thomas asked for what must have been the 10th time. Dr. Garcia glanced in the rearview mirror. Almost there. 20 minutes, maybe less. Thomas nodded, gently stroking Sophia's hair. She had barely been conscious when they left the village, mumbling in her feverish sleep. The coin felt heavy in his pocket, a constant reminder of what he was about to do. The city gradually appeared on the horizon, a sprawl of buildings and roads so different from their small coastal village. Thomas had only been here a handful of times, mostly for Sophia's medical appointments. He never felt comfortable among the tall buildings and crowded streets. But today the city represented hope. The hospital was a large white building near the center of town. Dr. Garcia pulled up to the emergency entrance and helped Thomas carry Sophia inside. Everything happened quickly after that. Nurses appearing with a wheeled bed, doctors asking questions, forms being pushed into Thomas's hands to sign. "I've called ahead to Dr. Lin," Dr. Garcia explained. "She's the specialist who's been overseeing Sophia's case. She'll be here soon." Thomas nodded numbly, watching as they wheeled Sophia away through swinging doors. He wanted to follow to make sure she wasn't scared, but a nurse gently stopped him. "We need to get her stabilized," she explained kindly. "The doctor will come talk to you as soon as possible." Dr. Garcia stayed long enough to make sure everything was arranged, then had to return to the village. "Call me if anything changes," he told Tomas. "And don't worry about the fishing boat. I'll tell Ana to ask Miguel to check on it." Left alone in the waiting room, Thomas felt out of place in his worn clothes and calloused hands. Other families sat nearby, some crying, some talking in hushed voices. The coin in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. After what felt like hours, a doctor in a white coat approached. "Mr. Santos? I'm Dr. Lin. We've admitted your daughter and started her on antibiotics for the lung infection. Will she be okay?" Tomas asked, his voice catching. Dr. Lin's face was serious but not unkind. "The next 24 hours will be critical. The infection is severe, but Sophia is a fighter. We'll do everything we can." They discussed treatment plans, medications, and, inevitably, costs. The medical program Dr. Garcia had mentioned would cover a significant portion, but not all. Thomas would need to make a payment within 2 days to continue the specialized treatment Sophia needed. "Can I see her?" Thomas asked when the doctor finished explaining. Dr. Lin nodded. "She's sedated right now, but you can sit with her. Room 312, 3rd floor." Sophia looked tiny in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped and hummed. Tomas sat beside her, holding her small hand in his rough one. The contrast struck him deeply, her smooth skin against his weathered palm. He had spent his life working on the sea to provide for her, and now her life depended on his ability to cross a different kind of line. "I'll do whatever it takes," he whispered to her sleeping form. "Whatever it takes." When a nurse came to check Sophia's vitals, Thomas reluctantly left her side. He needed to find someone who would buy the coin, no questions asked. But in a strange city, where would he even begin? Outside the hospital, the afternoon sun beat down on the busy streets. Thomas walked aimlessly at first, overwhelmed by the noise and movement. Then he remembered something Ricardo had once mentioned. A district in the city where antique shops clustered together, some legitimate, others willing to look the other way for the right item. It took Thomas nearly an hour of asking directions and getting lost in unfamiliar streets before he found the area. Old buildings housed shops with window displays of furniture, artwork, and curiosities. Some looked high-end and professional, others dusty and haphazard. Thomas chose a smaller shop tucked between two larger ones. The sign above the door read Vargas Antiquities and Collectibles in faded letters. A bell jingled as he pushed open the door, stepping into a space crowded with objects from every era. Old books, tarnished silverware, paintings in ornate frames. Behind a glass counter stood a man in his 60s, reading glasses perched on his nose as he examined a pocket watch. He looked up at Tomas's entrance, his expression shifting from polite interest to mild surprise as he took in Tomas's simple clothes and sun-darkened skin. "Can I help you?" the man asked, setting down the watch. Thomas hesitated. Now that he was here, doubt crept in. What if this man called the police? What if the coin was worthless? What if... The image of Sophia in the hospital bed flashed in his mind, strengthening his resolve. I have something to sell, Tomas said, approaching the counter. Something old. Valuable, I think. The man, Mr. Vargas, Thomas presumed, raised an eyebrow. And what might that be? Glancing around to make sure they were alone, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold coin, placing it carefully on the glass counter. Mr. Vargas's expression changed instantly. He reached for a magnifying glass and bent over the coin, examining it closely. After a long moment, he looked up at Thomas with sharp eyes. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice neutral but his gaze intense. "It was my grandfather's," Thomas lied, the words sticking in his throat. "He gave it to me years ago. Said it was from a shipwreck." The shopkeeper studied Tomas's face, clearly not believing the story but not challenging it either. "Your grandfather was correct. This appears to be a Spanish doubloon from the 16th century. If authentic, and I would need to verify that, it could be quite valuable."
How valuable?
Thomas asked, his heart pounding. Mr. Vargas named a figure that made Thomas's breath catch. It was more than enough for Sophia's treatment with money left over. "However," the man continued, "items like these are strictly regulated. There are laws about historical artifacts, especially those recovered from potential shipwrecks. I would need to see documentation of provenance before making any official offer." Thomas's hope deflated. "I don't have any papers." "I see." Mr. Vargas removed his glasses, polishing them slowly with a cloth. "In that case, I couldn't possibly make an official purchase." Their eyes met, and Thomas understood the unspoken message. Not official, but perhaps something else. "If, hypothetically, you were interested in selling this piece privately," the shopkeeper said carefully, "I might know someone who collects such items for personal enjoyment. Their offer would be lower than market value, of course, given the unusual circumstances." He named a new figure, significantly less than the first, but still enough for what Thomas needed. "When could I meet this collector?" Thomas asked. "Tomorrow evening." "I'll need time to contact them." Mr. Vargas wrote an address on a card and slid it across the counter. "Come at 8 p.m., bring the coin. Come alone." As Thomas reached for the coin, the shopkeeper placed his hand over it. "One more thing. If you happen to have found more items like this, my collector would be extremely interested." Thomas tensed. "There's just the one coin." The lie hung in the air between them. Mr. Vargas smiled thinly. "Of course. Just the one coin from your grandfather." He lifted his hand, allowing Thomas to take back the doubloon. "Until tomorrow, then." Outside the shop, Thomas let out a shaky breath. The encounter had left him unsettled. There had been something predatory in the man's interest, something that suggested Thomas was walking into dangerous territory. But what choice did he have? Back at the hospital, Sophia's condition remained unchanged. Thomas sat by her bed through the evening and night, dozing occasionally in the uncomfortable chair. Nurses came and went, checking monitors and adjusting medications. In the sterile hospital room, the world of hidden treasures and secretive antique dealers seemed like a dream. Morning brought a small improvement. Sophia's fever had dropped slightly, and her breathing seemed less labored. Dr. Lin was cautiously optimistic. "The antibiotics are starting to work," she told Thomas, "but she's not out of danger yet. The next phase of treatment will target the underlying blood condition. That's where the costs increase significantly." Thomas nodded, thinking of the meeting scheduled for that evening. "I'll have the payment by tomorrow." Throughout the day, Thomas barely left Sophia's side except to call Anna from a payphone in the hospital lobby. He told her about Sophia's condition but said nothing about the coin or the arranged meeting. Better she didn't know the details in case things went wrong. As evening approached, Thomas reluctantly prepared to leave. Sophia had woken briefly earlier, recognizing him and even managing a weak smile before drifting back to sleep. It gave him courage for what he needed to do. A nurse promised to stay close to Sophia's room while he was gone. "Take this," she said, handing him a card with the hospital's number. "Call any time to check on her." The address Mr. Vargas had given led Thomas to a wealthier part of the city, where large houses sat behind iron gates. The specific location was a high-end restaurant with valet parking and well-dressed patrons. Thomas, in his simple clothes, received disapproving looks as he approached the entrance. "I'm meeting someone," he told the host, who seemed about to turn him away. "Mr. Vargas sent me." Something changed in the host's manner. "Ah, yes. Please follow me." He was led through the main dining area to a private room at the back. The door opened to reveal Mr. Vargas sitting with another man at a table set with fine china and crystal glasses. The second man was younger, perhaps in his 40s, wearing an expensive suit and a watch that probably cost more than Thomas's boat. "Mr. Santos, right on time," Mr. Vargas said, standing to greet him. "This is Mr. Chen. He's very interested in your grandfather's heirloom." Mr. Chen didn't stand or offer to shake hands. He simply watched Thomas with calculating eyes. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Vargas tells me you have something extraordinary to show me." Thomas sat uncomfortably, aware of his rough appearance in these luxurious surroundings. Carefully, he took out the coin and placed it on the table. Mr. Chen picked it up, examining it with expert eyes. He didn't use a magnifying glass or any tools. He didn't need to. Thomas could tell immediately that this man knew exactly what he was looking at. "Authentic," Mr. Chen said after a moment. "From the San Cristobal fleet, I'd guess. 1545 or thereabouts." He set the coin down and fixed Thomas with a piercing stare. "Now, why don't you tell me the real story of how you found this?" Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. The room suddenly seemed smaller, the air thicker. He had the distinct feeling he had just walked into a trap. Thomas's mouth went dry as Mr. Chen waited for an answer. The private dining room suddenly felt like an interrogation chamber. "I found it while fishing," Thomas said finally, deciding a partial truth was safer than a complete lie. "It was in my net." Mr. Chen exchanged a glance with Mr. Vargas. "Just this one coin? Floating in the ocean? How convenient." "The sea gives up her secrets in her own time," Thomas said, falling back on an old saying his father had often repeated. A thin smile appeared on Mr. Chen's face. "Indeed she does." He leaned forward. "Mr. Santos, I respect a man who protects his interests. So let me be direct. One coin like this, while valuable, is merely a curiosity. But where there is one, there are usually more. A lot more." He pulled a checkbook from his jacket pocket. "I'm prepared to offer you twice what Vargas suggested for this single coin. Right now, no questions asked." The amount he named would cover Sophia's treatment with plenty left over. It was a generous offer, suspiciously so. "Or," Mr. Chen continued, "if you were to share the location of your fishing spot or any additional items you might have found, I could offer you much more. Enough to change your life completely." Thomas thought of the container buried on the beach, filled with coins and artifacts worth a fortune. He thought of Sophia in her hospital bed. He thought of Anna waiting anxiously at home. "I appreciate the offer," Thomas said carefully, "but all I found was this one coin." Mr. Chen studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Very well." He wrote out a check and slid it across the table. "For your grandfather's heirloom." As Thomas reached for the check, Mr. Chen's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "One last thing, Fisherman. If you change your mind about sharing more of your discovery, come back to Vargas, but don't even think about approaching anyone else. The market for such items is smaller than you might imagine, and we all talk to each other." The threat was clear. Thomas nodded, and Mr. Chen released his grip. "Pleasure doing business with you," Mr. Chen said, pocketing the coin. "Vargas will show you out." Outside the restaurant, Thomas stood on the sidewalk clutching the check, his heart pounding. The encounter had left him shaken but relieved. He had what he needed for Sophia's treatment without revealing the rest of his find. Still, Mr. Chen's parting words echoed in his mind, a warning not to cross people like him. Early the next morning, Thomas went to the bank to cash the check, half expecting it to bounce. To his surprise, the teller counted out the full amount without question. With the money securely in an envelope, he headed back to the hospital, stopping along the way to buy a small stuffed bear for Sophia. Dr. Lin met him outside Sophia's room, her expression more relaxed than the previous day. "Her condition has improved significantly overnight. The fever is down, and her breathing is much better. Can I make the payment for her continued treatment now?" Thomas asked, patting the envelope in his pocket. The doctor nodded, directing him to the billing department. With the payment made, Sophia was scheduled to begin the specialized treatment for her blood condition that afternoon. When Thomas entered her room, Sophia was awake, sitting up slightly in bed. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Papa, you brought me a bear." Her voice was weak but clear, and the sparkle had returned to her eyes. Thomas sat beside her. relief washing over him as they talked about small things: the nice nurses, the food, the view from her window. He didn't mention the coin or Mr. Chen. As far as Sophia knew, the money for her treatment had come from a program Dr. Garcia had found. Later that day, as Sophia underwent her first specialized treatment, Thomas stepped outside the hospital to call Anna from a payphone. "The doctors say she's responding well," he told his wife. "They think she'll be able to come home in about a week if the treatments continue working." "Thank God," Anna said, her voice catching. "I've been so worried, and the other matter? Did you manage to—" "It's taken care of," Thomas said simply. "I'll explain everything when I get home." After hanging up, Thomas wandered through a small park across from the hospital, thinking deeply about what to do next. The meeting with Mr. Chen had made one thing clear: people like him would stop at nothing to get their hands on the rest of the treasure. If word got out about what he had found, his family could be in danger. But keeping the treasure hidden and selling it piece by piece would mean living in constant fear of discovery. It would mean more meetings with people like Mr. Chen, more lies, more looking over his shoulder. Was that the life he wanted? Was that the example he wanted to set for Sophia? As Thomas sat on a park bench, watching pigeons peck at crumbs, a news broadcast caught his attention from a nearby radio. A group of workers were gathered around it listening during their break. "Historical find off the coast," the announcer was saying. "Archaeologists believe they have located the remains of the Spanish galleon San Cristobal, which sank during a storm in 1545. The ship was rumored to be carrying a substantial cargo of gold and artifacts from the New World. The discovery could shed new light on trade, routes, and maritime history of the region." Thomas froze. The San Cristobal, the same ship Mr. Chen had mentioned when examining the coin. It couldn't be a coincidence. He approached the workers. "Excuse me, where did they find the shipwreck?" One of them shrugged. "About 30 miles south of here, I think. Some special currents shifted the sand or something." The same unusual currents Thomas had noticed the day of the storm. The realization hit him like a physical blow. What he had found wasn't just a random treasure. It was part of a historically significant shipwreck, one that researchers were actively looking for. Back in Sophia's room, Thomas made a decision. After she fell asleep that evening, he used the hospital phone to make a call. Not to Anna or to Mr. Vargas, but to the University Archaeological Department mentioned in the news report. The next morning, a woman named Dr. Reyes arrived at the hospital. She was in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and intelligent eyes behind simple glasses. She listened without interruption as Thomas told her the full story: the storm, the strange currents, the container filled with coins and artifacts. He showed her the jade figurine which he had kept with him rather than trying to sell it. "This is remarkable," she said, examining the small carving. "It appears to be of Aztec origin. If what you've found is indeed from the San Cristobal, it's an incredibly significant historical discovery." "What happens now?" Thomas asked. "If I show you where I found it and where I buried the container?" Dr. Reyes explained the laws regarding historical artifacts and shipwrecks. The items would need to be turned over to the proper authorities for study and preservation. But as the finder, Thomas would be entitled to a reward, a percentage of the value determined by a committee. "It won't be as much as you might get selling the items illegally," she said frankly, "but it would be substantial, legitimate, and without risk of imprisonment." "And these people studying shipwrecks?" Thomas asked. "Would they need someone who knows the local waters? Someone who could help them navigate the currents and find more artifacts?" Dr. Reyes smiled. "We absolutely would. Are you offering your services, Mr. Santos?" 3 months later, Thomas stood on the deck of a research vessel, pointing out the location of the strange currents to a team of marine archaeologists. His small fishing boat was tied alongside, dwarfed by the larger ship but still essential for accessing the shallower areas. The reward money for turning in the artifacts had been generous, enough to pay for Sophia's full treatment and recovery, to repair their home, and to outfit his boat with better equipment. But more importantly, Thomas had been hired as a consultant for the archaeological expedition, providing his invaluable knowledge of local waters and weather patterns. Sophia, now back home and steadily regaining her strength, proudly told everyone that her papa was helping discover history, Anna had been relieved by Thomas's decision to turn in the artifacts legally, though she admitted there had been a moment of shock when he first told her. "You gave up a fortune," she had said. "No," he had replied. "I found something better than gold." As the research team prepared to dive to a newly discovered section of the wreck, Tomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The sea, which had been his livelihood for so long, had given him a new purpose, one that came without the weight of secrets or fear. Old Pedro joined him at the railing, having been hired as a second local consultant based on Thomas's recommendation. "The sea gives and takes in her own time," the old man said, echoing the saying Thomas had repeated to Mr. Chen. "She certainly does," Thomas agreed, watching the divers disappear beneath the waves. That evening, as the research vessel headed back to shore, Thomas called Anna from the ship's radio. Sophia answered, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Papa, did you find more treasure today?" Thomas smiled, looking out at the sunset painting the water in shades of gold. "Every day is treasure now, little one. Every single day." And as the coast of his village came into view, Thomas knew it was true. The net he had pulled from the water during that desperate storm had contained more than just gold and artifacts. It had contained a future, one where his family was secure, his daughter was healthy, and he could face each day with pride in his work and his choices. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries aren't the ones that glitter, but the ones that show us who we truly are.